The small, dimly lit chapel was heavy with grief. The air smelled faintly of old wood and the waxy scent of burning candles, their flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. Rows of wooden pews were filled with mourners, their heads bowed, tissues clutched tightly in trembling hands. At the front of the room, surrounded by a sea of flowers, stood a polished oak coffin. Inside lay the body of a young father, taken too soon by a tragic accident. The man's wife, Sarah, sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn. Her dark circles betrayed nights spent crying, and her hands clutched the tiny fingers of her 2-year-old son, Tommy, who sat quietly beside her. The boy was too young to understand the weight of the moment, his wide, innocent eyes darting around the room as if searching for something or someone. Tommy fidgeted in his seat, his little legs swinging back and forth, his shiny black shoes brushing against the pew. He kept turning his head toward the coffin, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to make sense of the strange box that held his father. Suddenly, he pointed a chubby finger at it and babbled, "Daddy's not sleeping." Sarah's heart clenched at the sound of her son's voice, so small and uncertain. She leaned down and whispered, "Shush, sweetheart. Daddy's resting now." But Tommy wasn't satisfied. He pointed again, more insistently this time, his voice rising slightly. "Daddy's not sleeping." A few heads turned in their direction, and Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. She gently pulled Tommy's hand down, her voice trembling as she tried to soothe him. "It's okay, Tommy. We'll talk about it later." The boy's insistence was unsettling, but no one paid much attention. To the mourners, it was just the innocent confusion of a child too young to grasp the finality of death. The priest continued his eulogy, his voice a steady, comforting drone, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Before we move forward, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring and educational stories. Tommy's words echoed in her mind. "Daddy's not sleeping." She glanced at the coffin, her eyes lingering on its polished surface. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. But when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, chiding herself for letting her imagination run wild. Grief did strange things to the mind, after all. As the service continued, Tommy grew more restless. He kept pointing at the coffin, his tiny voice cutting through the solemn silence. "Daddy's not sleeping. Daddy's not sleeping." Sarah's sister, sitting beside her, leaned over and whispered, "He's just confused, Sarah. He doesn't understand." Sarah nodded, but the knot in her stomach tightened. She couldn't explain it, but something about Tommy's insistence felt different. It wasn't just the innocent ramblings of a child. There was something in his tone, something urgent, that sent a chill down her spine. The priest's voice rose in a final prayer, and the mourners bowed their heads. But Tommy didn't close his eyes. He kept staring at the coffin, his little hand still pointing, his lips moving silently, as if repeating the same phrase over and over. "Daddy's not sleeping." And somewhere, deep in the back of Sarah's mind, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, her son knew something the rest of them didn't. The funeral service dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The priest's voice, though calm and measured, did little to ease the tension that had begun to ripple through the room. All eyes were on Tommy now, the little boy who refused to sit still, his small voice cutting through the solemn atmosphere like a knife. "Daddy's not sleeping," Tommy exclaimed again, louder this time. His tiny finger was still pointed at the coffin, his face scrunched up in frustration. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to shush him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy, please, sweetheart." "Not now." But Tommy wouldn't be silenced. He squirmed in her lap, his little body twisting as he tried to break free. "Daddy's not sleeping," he repeated, his voice rising with each word. Sarah's sister, Emily, leaned over and gently took Tommy's hand, trying to distract him. "Hey, buddy, Let's look at this picture book, okay? She said, pulling a small book from her purse. Tommy glanced at the book for a moment, but his attention quickly returned to the coffin. He shook his head vigorously, his dark curls bouncing. No, Daddy's not sleeping. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's stares. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but beneath that, a deeper unease was beginning to take root. Tommy's insistence was more than just childish confusion. It felt urgent, almost desperate. From the corner of her eye, Sarah noticed her mother-in-law, Margaret, glaring at her from across the aisle. The older woman's lips were pressed into a thin line, her disapproval evident. Sarah knew what she was thinking. Control your child. This is a funeral, not a playground. But Tommy wasn't throwing a tantrum. He wasn't crying or screaming. He was insistent, and it was starting to unnerve her. As the priest continued his sermon, a faint sound interrupted the stillness, a muffled thud, like something shifting inside the coffin. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes darting toward the source of the noise. For a moment, she thought she saw the lid of the coffin tremble, but when she blinked, it was perfectly still. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Emily, her voice trembling. Emily frowned, glancing at the coffin. "Hear what?" That sound. Like a thud. Emily shook her head, her expression softening with pity. "It's just the old floorboards, Sarah. This church is ancient. It's probably just settling." Sarah nodded, but the explanation did little to ease her growing anxiety. She glanced down at Tommy, who was still pointing at the coffin, his little hand now shaking with effort. "Daddy's not sleeping," he said again, his voice cracking with emotion. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to believe it was just a child's misunderstanding, but something about Tommy's behavior felt different. It was as if he could sense something no one else could. The priest paused, his eyes flickering toward Tommy before he continued speaking. The room was growing restless, the tension palpable. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. She leaned down and whispered in Tommy's ear, her voice trembling. "Tommy, please, baby. We'll talk about Daddy later, okay?" But Tommy shook his head, his eyes wide and pleading. "No, Mommy. Daddy's not sleeping. He's not." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the hope that somehow, impossibly, he was right. But the rational part of her mind pushed the thought away. It was impossible. Her husband was gone. And yet, another sound, louder this time, echoed through the chapel. It was unmistakable, a dull thud, like a fist pounding against wood. The entire room froze, the air thick with tension. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the coffin, her mind racing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, her eyes wide. I think so." The priest cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to regain control of the room. "Let us continue," he said, though his words lacked their earlier conviction. Sarah's hands trembled as she held Tommy close, her mind spinning. The faint sound, Tommy's insistence, the growing unease, it was all too much. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone open the coffin and prove her fears wrong. But she stayed silent, her voice trapped in her throat. Tommy, however, had no such reservations. He wriggled out of her grasp and stood up in the pew, his tiny hands gripping the back of the seat in front of him. "Daddy's not sleeping," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chapel. The room erupted into murmurs, the tension reaching a breaking point. Sarah reached for Tommy, but he was already climbing over the pew, his little legs carrying him toward the coffin. "Tommy, no," she cried, her voice cracking. But it was too late. The boy was already running down the aisle, his cries filling the room. "Daddy's not sleeping. Daddy's not sleeping." And as Sarah chased after him, her heart pounding in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unimaginable was about to happen. The chapel was a powder keg of tension, every eye fixed on the small boy now standing in front of the coffin. Tommy's tiny fists pounded against the polished oak, his cries piercing the heavy silence. "Daddy's awake. Daddy's awake." Sarah's heart raced as she rushed forward, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Tommy, stop," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She reached for him, but he dodged her grasp, his little hands still pressed against the coffin. The pallbearers, who had been preparing to carry the coffin to the gravesite, froze in place, their faces pale with shock. The priest stepped forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture, but his expression was uneasy. "Please, everyone, remain calm," he said, though his voice wavered. "This is a difficult time for all of us, especially the child." But Tommy wasn't just any child in this moment. He was a force of nature, his small body trembling with determination. "Daddy's awake," he shouted again, his voice breaking. "Open it! Open it!" The room erupted into murmurs, the mourners shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah's mother-in-law, Margaret, stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "Someone needs to control that child." Sarah ignored her, her focus entirely on Tommy. She knelt beside him, her hands gently gripping his shoulders. "Tommy, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. Daddy's gone. He's not in there anymore." But Tommy shook his head fiercely, tears streaming down his face. "No, Mommy. He's awake. I heard him." As if on cue, a faint scratching sound came from inside the coffin. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in horror. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The pallbearers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them, a burly man with a graying beard, nodded slowly. I think I did," he admitted. The priest stepped forward, his face pale but composed. "It's likely just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or the old wood settling. This church has a way of playing tricks on the mind." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the coffin, her mind racing. Tommy's cries, the scratching sound, the growing unease, it was all too much to ignore. "Open it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The room fell silent, every eye turning to her in shock. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sarah, have you lost your mind? This is your husband's funeral." But Sarah stood her ground, her eyes blazing with determination. "I said open it," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "If there's even a chance that Tommy is right, we need to know." The pallbearers hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. The priest stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sarah, I understand your distress, but this is highly irregular. We must respect the sanctity of the— Open it," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing through the chapel. The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The pallbearers exchanged uneasy glances before the bearded man finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But if this is a mistake, it's on you." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding as she watched the men step forward. Tommy clung to her leg, his little body trembling with anticipation. "Daddy's awake," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. The pallbearers positioned themselves around the coffin, their hands gripping the edges of the lid. With a collective heave, they lifted it, the sound of creaking wood filling the room. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the coffin. The lid was set aside, and the room collectively gasped. Inside, her husband lay motionless, his face pale and peaceful. For a moment, Sarah's heart sank, the weight of disappointment crushing her. But then, she saw it, a faint twitch of his finger, followed by a soft, shuddering breath. "Oh my God," one of the pallbearers whispered, his voice filled with awe. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "He's alive," she choked out, her voice barely audible. The room erupted into chaos. the mourners surging forward as the pallbearers scrambled to lift her husband from the coffin. Tommy clung to Sarah's leg, his little face filled with relief. "I told you, Mommy," he said, his voice trembling. "Daddy's not sleeping." And as Sarah watched her husband being carried out of the chapel, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, she couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for her son's unwavering insistence. Tommy had been right all along. The chapel, once a place of somber reflection, was now a scene of utter chaos. The pallbearers had barely set the coffin lid aside when the gasps and cries of the mourners filled the air. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on her husband's face. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, but there was no mistaking it. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. "He's alive," someone shouted, their voice cutting through the noise. Sarah's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching the edge of the coffin. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, he's alive." Tommy clung to her side, his little face pressed against her arm. "I told you, Mommy," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "Daddy's not sleeping." The funeral director, a tall man with a stern expression, rushed forward, his face pale with shock. "This is impossible," he stammered. "He was pronounced dead. There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. Sarah's husband, though barely conscious, was undeniably alive. His eyelids fluttered, and a faint groan escaped his lips as the pallbearers carefully lifted him from the coffin. "Call an ambulance," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. Now, the room erupted into action. Someone pulled out a phone and dialed 911, their voice frantic as they explained the situation. Others crowded around, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Margaret, Sarah's mother-in-law, stood frozen in the aisle, her hands pressed to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "How could this happen?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and anger. "How could they make such a mistake?" Sarah didn't have an answer. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a jumbled mess of relief, fear, and disbelief. She reached out and took her husband's hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his cold skin. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Please, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, she felt it, a weak but unmistakable squeeze. A sob escaped her lips, and she pressed her forehead against his hand, her body shaking with emotion. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the chaos. Within minutes, paramedics burst into the chapel, their faces a mask of professionalism as they assessed the situation. They quickly took over, carefully transferring Sarah's husband onto a stretcher and hooking him up to monitors. "He's in a coma," one of the paramedics said, his voice calm but urgent. "His vitals are weak, but he's stable. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She turned to Emily, who was standing nearby, her face pale with shock. "Take Tommy," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I need to go with him." Emily nodded, her arms reaching out to take Tommy. But the little boy clung to Sarah, his face filled with fear. "No, Mommy. I want to stay with Daddy." Sarah knelt down, her hands gently cupping Tommy's face. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Daddy's going to be okay, but he needs help right now. Aunt Emily will take care of you, and I'll be back as soon as I can." "Okay." Tommy hesitated, his lower lip trembling, but he finally nodded. "Okay," he whispered. Sarah pressed a kiss to his forehead before standing and rushing after the paramedics. The mourners parted as she passed, their faces filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped away, the chapel fell into an uneasy silence. The funeral director stood in the aisle, his face pale and drawn. "I don't understand," he muttered. "He was pronounced dead. This shouldn't be possible." But it was possible. And as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, The mourners couldn't help but think back to Tommy's earlier insistence. "Daddy's not sleeping." The words, once dismissed as a child's confusion, now carried a weight that sent shivers down their spines. Tommy had known something no one else had, something that defied logic and reason. And as the chapel emptied, the faint sound of scratching still seemed to linger in the air, a haunting reminder of the truth that had nearly been buried forever. The hospital room was bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything feel just a little bit softer, a little bit kinder. Sarah sat by her husband's bedside, her fingers intertwined with his. His face was still pale, but there was color returning to his cheeks, and his breathing was steady now, no longer the shallow, uneven gasps that had terrified her at the funeral. It had been a week since the shocking discovery at the chapel, and the days had blurred together in a haze of tests, treatments, and tearful reunions. The doctors had confirmed what Sarah already knew. Her husband had been in a deep coma, his body in a state so close to death that even the most experienced medical professionals had been fooled. It was a miracle he had survived, they said. A miracle. But Sarah knew it wasn't just a miracle. It was Tommy. Her son sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his little legs swinging back and forth as he chattered away to his father, who was still too weak to respond, but whose eyes followed every movement with quiet intensity. Tommy had barely left his father's side since they'd arrived at the hospital, his small presence a constant source of comfort and hope. "Daddy's getting better," Tommy said, his voice filled with the kind of certainty only a child could possess. "He's going to wake up soon." Sarah smiled, though her eyes were wet with tears. "Yes, he is," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Tommy's forehead. "Thanks to you." The door opened, and Emily stepped inside, carrying a tray of coffee cups. She handed one to Sarah and set another on the bedside table before sitting down in the chair beside her. "How's he doing?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Better," Sarah said, her gaze returning to her husband's face. "The doctors say he's making progress. It's just slow." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And how are you doing?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm relieved, of course. But I'm also angry. How could this have happened? How could they have pronounced him dead when he was still alive?" It was a question that had been haunting her since that day at the chapel. The hospital had launched an investigation, and the funeral director had been quick to shift the blame, but none of it brought Sarah any peace. The thought of what could have happened, what almost happened, was enough to keep her awake at night. Emily reached over and squeezed her hand. "I don't have an answer for you," she said quietly. "But I do know this: Tommy saved him. However it happened, whatever mistakes were made, your little boy knew. He knew when no one else did." Sarah glanced at Tommy, who was now busy drawing a picture on a piece of hospital stationery. He looked so small, so innocent, and yet there was something about him that felt different, special. "Do you think he knew?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, really knew? Or was it just a coincidence?" Emily hesitated, her gaze following Sarah's. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I do know that Tommy's always been a little different. He sees things other people don't. Maybe he just has a gift." Sarah nodded, though the thought sent a shiver down her spine. A gift. It sounded so simple, but it felt anything but. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, her husband began to recover. His first words were raspy and weak, but they were enough to bring Sarah to tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes locking onto Tommy's. "Thank you, buddy." Tommy beamed, his little face lighting up with pride. "I told you, Daddy," he said. "You're not done yet." The words sent a chill through Sarah, though she couldn't quite explain why. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the joy of having her family whole again. As the weeks passed, the story of Tommy's heroism spread through the town. He became a local hero, the little boy who had saved his father's life. Strangers stopped Sarah in the grocery store to ask about him, their faces filled with awe and curiosity. But Tommy seemed unfazed by the attention. He was just happy to have his daddy back. One evening, as Sarah tucked him into bed, Tommy pointed at a family photo on the wall. It was an old picture taken before the accident, and it showed the three of them smiling and laughing, their faces filled with joy. "Daddy's not done yet," Tommy said, his voice soft but certain. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tommy just smiled, his eyes drifting closed as he snuggled deeper into his blankets. "He's not done yet," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring at the photo. The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a strange, unshakable sense of unease. "He's not done yet." What did it mean? Was it just the innocent rambling of a child, or was it something more? She didn't have an answer, but as she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy's words were more than just a simple statement. They were a warning. The story of Tommy and his father is one that lingers long after the final page is turned. It is a tale that weaves together the threads of intuition, love, and the delicate balance between life and death, leaving readers with more questions than answers. At its core, the narrative explores profound themes that resonate deeply with the human experience, inviting reflection on the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding. Tommy's unwavering insistence that his father was not dead, despite all evidence to the contrary, serves as a powerful reminder of the inexplicable nature of intuition. Children, with their unclouded minds and unfiltered perceptions, often sense things that adults dismiss as impossible. Tommy's intuition, though dismissed at first as childish confusion, ultimately saves his father's life. This theme challenges us to consider the limits of logic and reason, suggesting that there are forces at work in the world that defy explanation. How often do we ignore our instincts in favor of what we're told is real or possible? Tommy's story urges us to listen more closely to those quiet, insistent voices within us. Even in the face of death, Tommy refuses to let go of the belief that his father is still with him. This bond transcends the physical world, suggesting that love can bridge even the most impossible divides. Sarah's journey, too, highlights the lengths a parent will go to protect and believe in their child. Her decision to trust Tommy's instincts, despite the protests of others, underscores the depth of her faith in him. The story celebrates the idea that family ties are not easily broken, even by the most devastating of circumstances. The near tragedy of the father's mistaken death serves as a stark reminder of how fragile life truly is. One moment, the family is planning a funeral. The next, they are grappling with the miraculous return of a loved one. This theme forces readers to confront the unpredictability of existence and the importance of cherishing every moment. It also raises uncomfortable questions about the fallibility of systems we trust, such as medical and funeral practices, and the consequences of human error. The story is a poignant reminder that life is precious, fleeting, and often hangs by the thinnest of threads. Perhaps the most haunting theme of the story is the exploration of the boundaries between life and death. The father's coma, so deep that it mimicked death, blurs the line between the two states, leaving us to wonder where one ends and the other begins. Tommy's ability to sense his father's lingering presence suggests that these boundaries may be more fluid than we think. The story invites us to consider what lies beyond the veil of death and whether the connections we forge in life can transcend it. Tommy's strange abilities, his insistence that his father was alive, his apparent foresight, hint at the untapped potential of the human mind. Is it possible that some people possess gifts that science cannot explain? The story leaves this question open, suggesting that there are mysteries within us that we have yet to understand. Tommy's final words, "Daddy's not done yet," linger in the air like an unsolved riddle, hinting that his intuition may extend beyond this single event. What else does he know? What else can he sense? The story challenges us to consider the possibility that the human mind is capable of far more than we realize. The story is more than just a tale of a miraculous survival. It is a meditation on the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the mysteries that bind us to one another. It challenges us to question what we think we know about life, death, and the connections that transcend both. And, perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are found in the voices of the smallest among us. Thanks for watching. Let us know where you're tuning in from and share your thoughts on the story. We can't wait to bring you the next one. Peace out.